So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on public goods and what model for the future. My name is Arthur Muliro, and I'll be moderating this session for the next 40 or so minutes, and it's a pleasure to have you all join us. We have with us a very distinguished panel, and I'll get to introduce them in a few minutes, or rather they'll introduce themselves. But I'd just like to say a few words maybe to set the stage and the context for the conversation that we're going to have. And I do hope it is a conversation. So in other words, that you'll also get an opportunity to participate and to have your say on this subject. So public goods, which are those essential resources that benefit society as a whole, I think are going through significant transformations. And this is given by the fact that we have rapid technological advancement, we have environmental challenges, and of course society itself is changing. It is not static. On the other hand, as these things happen, there are a number of key dilemmas and tensions that are emerging. We can look at questions around how are we going to provide clean water, education, and healthcare. I think those are standard things, or even transportation, that in many of our countries people worry about. But then there are also new advances that are coming up and are creating new problems that previously our leaders in our societies were not thinking about. When you consider the challenges of new technological advances, some people have access to ICT. It's creating new disparities. How are we going to manage these, and how is this going to sort of set the stage for how people may access or not access some of these public goods? When we look at the current climate crisis, of course we must reevaluate how we are looking at public goods that are related to the environment. Questions around sustainability, renewable energy, conservation, and perhaps more than ever before, the question of how future generations are going to benefit or going to be impacted by our actions today also comes to light. Then I've mentioned the whole story about how technology is emerging and how this is creating new opportunities for us. But at the same time, it's also necessary to look at what are some of the challenges that come with this, and certainly you have issues around privacy, security, and some of the unintended consequences that are generating new tensions. Which is to say, there are benefits to this, but then also what is the dark side or the darker side of some of these advances. And the critical thing, I guess, is how are we going to find a healthy balance between innovation and regulation, between the benefit for the majority and make sure that they can serve the largest number of people without compromising our freedoms and our rights. So to help us navigate this terrain, we have with us three panelists who come from very different backgrounds, but I think also have very interesting perspectives on these issues. I've had the opportunity to engage with them over the past few days, and I think their insights will help us sort of navigate this terrain. So to my immediate left, we have Crystal Simeoni. Crystal is from Kenya, and she's a director of the NAWI, African Feminist Macroeconomic Collective, and she can tell you a little bit more about what they do and how she comes into this conversation on public goods. Next to her is Christina Pak, who is a principal counsel in the Office of the General Counsel at the Asian Development Bank in Manila. That's a regional financial institution, and I think they also have a very interesting take, and I believe you've been doing some interesting works, particularly around nature and the environment and how that plays out. And last but not least, to my very left is Daniel Bloom, who is head of the corporate governance unit at the OECD in Paris. And I think he'll also be telling us some very interesting, giving us some insights about how the corporate governance scene is evolving to also accommodate some of these shifts around public goods. So welcome, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I hope you are too. And so I'll just pass on to perhaps Daniel, if you can just start us off and give us a take on tell us a little bit about what you do and your take on on the topic. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to start, the OECD, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is based in Paris and is an organization of 38 member countries, which are mainly the most advanced democracies in the world. And they basically promote global good standard recommendations in the full range of policy areas that may be impacted by globalization. The organization has also been evolving quite a bit. The committee that I work for, which is called the Corporate Governance Committee, which has policymakers and securities regulators from the different members of the OECD countries, also has as members all of the G20 countries, because we thought it was quite important. You can't deal with corporate governance issues in global markets without having all of the biggest economies in the world, so China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and other countries all fully participate in this work. And what we've seen in recent years, I mean, the OECD has started 25 years ago, developed the OECD Principles of Corporate Governance, which later became, when we started partnering with the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. And in parallel to that, we also developed standards for state-owned companies, which are called the OECD Guidelines for Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprises. And that's really quite important, the state-owned side of things, because when we talk about achievement of public goods and public benefits, globally, things have really been changing over the last 10 to 20 years. I think the number, if you take the Fortune top 500 global companies, the number of state-owned companies in that top 500 has tripled over the last 20 years. So there are huge state companies, state energy companies, for example, that are also critical and that are driven by the state. So you need to have two different models of governance for these two different types of companies, but there are also some commonalities. And just to bring it back to public goods, because I know we should have a short intro, I think we're really concerned primarily at this moment. We've just revised the G20 OECD principles, and we're in the process of revising the standard for state-owned enterprises. They need to be adapted to the climate crisis. So each of these standards now have adopted or are developing new chapters on sustainability issues. So one important public good is this dealing with and taking account of the environment. And the second one I would say is trust, because there's a shortage of trust. And what is governance about? It's having the structures, the requirements, and in some cases voluntary standards in place that you can achieve or build trust, because otherwise the whole system breaks down if people don't believe that the institutions will function.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Christina.
Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be here, and thanks for being here, making time for this session, and also to the organizers. So I'm from the Asian Development Bank. We're comprised of 68 member countries, but our real clients are 49 countries from the Asia-Pacific region. So unlike Daniel, he deals more with like advanced economies. Our real clients are the developing economies, especially the SIDS and the least developed. So they have different challenges. And I sit at the legal department, and basically my mandate is I manage the law and policy reform program, and basically we focus on legal and regulatory reforms, as well as we look at governance and standards that we bring to our client countries as well, and then capacity building. From a development perspective, public goods is an area that ADB, as well as the other multilateral development banks are really focusing on, because it impacts upon livelihoods, how people live, and the ecosystems they generate. It's really valuable. But I would say that public goods are threatened. They're threatened by market failures. So basically, public goods, the traditional, model that they're basically managed or provided for by governments is very much challenged these days. And then Daniel talked about different stakeholders that are becoming involved, and one of the key stakeholders that are, actually helping to manage and deliver public goods is the private sector. And I think Arthur alluded to the fact that there's pros and cons, but the private sector has become an important player in partnering with the state, in partnering with the communities, in helping to manage, deliver, and also attracting the finance. I guess in that respect, in terms of the private sector, what they look for is also clear standards, predictability. Environmental rule of law. I would say it's very important. But I think later on I'll probably kind of talk about, with the entrance of private sector, there's also different models that are emerging, different nature finance type of instruments. Of course, it's all good, it's very much welcome, but in terms of the different types of interests that private sector and the state, and as well as the community, there needs to be some sort of, I would say, alignment. More conversations has to be had as to what would be the appropriate arrangement to make sure that there's sufficient benefit sharing, that everyone's interests are aligned. And I think about Futures and Foresight, we had the opportunity to apply this development tool in the work that we do, and I would say that it's an important tool to kind of have a shared vision and I guess a shared alignment, because the changing socioeconomic realities, and then the green transition, and then there's opportunities with digital transformation. It actually kind of, I think, forces all of us to kind of adapt our models or come with a different model. So I'm looking forward to having, delving deeper into that conversation of what types of, what the appropriate model could be, given, I guess, the changing landscape of all the different players and issues that we're dealing with now. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Crystal.
Thanks. My name's Crystal. I live and work out of Kenya, and I'm Kenyan. Identify as a Pan-African feminist, and my feminism is rooted in the idea and the ideology that Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, have a common history and a shared destiny, and the only way to get to that shared destiny is collectively. So just to give you an idea of what my worldview is and what I'll be speaking from, I lead a newish organization and collective called NAWI, and we work on narrative shifting, but also contributing to a body of knowledge on macroeconomics. A lot of the time when you hear of Africa, the economy, and women, it will most likely be in relation to micro-interventions that are very individually targeted. So microfinance, financial inclusion, livelihood projects that look at individuals. And there's a place for that, but there's a broader conversation to be had. If you do give me, a microloan for 50 chickens, as is the commonplace in my region, I still need to be taking my children to a public school that offers quality, universally accessible education. The same for schools, the same for infrastructure, roads, and all of those things. And these public goods and services, that is the point of this conversation today. So our conversation and our narrative and our analysis is really having a Pan-African feminist analysis that is rooted in our histories, in our contexts, in our nuances, that can begin to define and analyze the questions and the problems based on that for ourselves. And from that also then look at what possible solutions, what possible alternatives exist. This really goes back to also looking at what we call a social contract that is between state and citizen, and looking at how it's formulated, who does it engage with, and who has the power to speak up, both in global spaces, in regional spaces, and in national spaces, right down to the household. How do you uphold it? How do you uphold it in a region like mine on the continent that has our social contracts morphing into moving away from being between state and citizen to moving towards being state and private sector, or private finance really, backed by institutions like the World Bank, like IMF, when our countries are repeatedly in a state of really deep levels of debt. It means that our states are constantly being pushed to step out of public goods and public services provisioning. And what does that mean? If a maternal health care unit isn't profitable, that doesn't get invested in, and a mega infrastructure highway or rail will be. And what does that mean for the dignity of life, the dignity of people? So we do a lot of work in that analysis, providing analysis. This has been an interesting space for me. I look a lot at reclaiming our histories, cautioning us to not move so quickly into the future before we can reclaim ourselves and our past and our histories. And sometimes the alternatives, the solutions, the things that we can look to have been done before. And we had a conversation this morning, and I was reminded about the 7-generation principle, which I think is from Indigenous America, that centered this idea to look at 7 generations in the future. Anything that we decide, what would happen to 7 generations in the future? And that's something that seems to have been forgotten. And it's our role really as we look to the future to also do a lot of work actually, in reclaiming our past. Designing and modeling for the future must be political and must be historical at the same time.
So thank you, Crystal. And just hold on to the mic because I think we'll go back the other way.
Okay.
You've spoken a lot about how social contracts are, the basis through which maybe the public goods are seen and then provisioned. Which are some of the power dynamics in your experience that are at play, and how are communities, the ones particularly that you referred to, getting involved in trying to have an influence on this emergent dynamic that you say, where it's moving from state to citizen to state to private actors?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for this sort of conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's different levels. NAWI is both regional and global facing. We don't do very much at a national level, but our analysis is informed by national and very local experiences. And we oscillate between the technical and the colloquial, because change will only come from a groundswell up. Hardly ever is it from, technical work. There is change there, but really the biggest push has to be collective action. Power is central to a feminist analysis, and you can see it. Recently, just this last week, actually, the UN finally did a vote on where tax is governed. It originally, and has been up until now, has been governed within the OECD, which means that countries in Africa, for example, don't have a seat at that table, yet we have to implement what decisions that are made there. So who has the agency, who has the voice, who has meaningful representation in global governance spaces, especially economic governance spaces, to make sure that there are policies, frameworks, guidelines that make sure that we have an equitable, fair, and just world. Something that we guide ourselves at NAWI is everything that we do must be in service of life, and this idea that the harvest must always be mutual. Everybody must be able to have access, voice, agency, and be able to live in a just society, both planetary and economically. Part of the work that we've done is we've written a conceptual frame of public services and goods from a Pan-African feminist perspective, and it has 3 interweaving threads. The first is that states must be answerable to people. That's a basic premises. And when I talk about the state in this case, I talk about a reimagined state. I come from a region where our states can be extremely violent in many ways on our citizens, but we must center them, but center them in a reimagined state, in a reimagined form. The second one is that we must end exclusion and advance justice through a public provisioning of universally accessible both goods and services. Ooh, technology, here we go. The third is to reject the commodification of dignity. The privatization of all these services means that only some people have access. User fees leave out so many people from accessing life-sustaining services and goods. The fourth is the value for public service actors and workers. How do we uphold teachers, nurses, doctors in our public sector, and what does that look like in both remuneration, but in also the work environment and access to instruments that they need? The fifth is making public money work for the public, and that's also a very central point. The money is ours and should be used to make sure that life is just and dignifiable. And the sixth is something that is close to the heart for many Africans, is reclaiming the idea of Ubuntu. I am because you are, both in terms of planet, but in terms of people, and understanding that at the very basic premise is we only have each other, and we can only move ahead with each other, and there's no way we can leave others out. And we've seen through COVID what that means and the impact that has. And so there is resistance in terms of an epistemological resistance to who's producing knowledge, who's asking the questions, who's providing alternatives. Who are we publishing? Who are we reading? Whose knowledge are we basing our analysis on is really political, and that there's been shifts there. And just the politics of listening to people who are living and making sure that there's value in their analysis, in their voices, and their experiences, and making sure that we're holding qualitative information and data just in the same importance as quantitative. And what's the role of stories and narratives of our people? And making sure that those are heard in a meaningful way in spaces of power where decisions on all our lives are made.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Very detailed answer. Christina, you were speaking earlier on in your introduction about market failures in public goods. Would you like to speak more about that and maybe give us your view of how do you think public goods ought to be valued? And as you do that, take Crystal's point here where she's saying that they are against the commodification of dignity. So how does that play out with the way you're seeing the public goods being valued or revalued?
Public goods, what Crystal said, it needs to be reimagined, rethought of, because the traditional idea of public goods, it's evolved, and even the idea of public goods has different elements. It has elements now of sustainability, of equity, of including intergenerational equity, and it also has intrinsic value, right? It's not just commercial value. And then I think what's also changing is who delivers, manages public goods, especially nature. And back, I think I alluded to this before, that it was delivered by the state. So I think the role of the different stakeholders, who delivers, manages, finances, enjoys, public good, nature as a public good, also needs to be reimagined. And I think one of the, now with the private sector and different stakeholders that want to help, it shouldn't just fall to the state, because the state is very resource constrained. And I think the role of the state, the role of the market, private sector, the role of communities need to be reimagined and shifted. So in that way, what I think Crystal said about, what are the elements to make this work? Because, there's lots of, different private models that have emerged, and that's certainly helping to protect nature. There's various PPP models, like traditional PPP models, like concession agreements. There's new, nature finance, sustainability linked finance. But with these, payment for ecosystem services, even the carbon markets. So something as new as the carbon markets, it's a market mechanism. But if you really think about who are the stakeholders involved, so the traditional model, doesn't fit that anymore. So we have to kind of reimagine, in that, in this new model, the purpose is to generate, funds, projects that protect the public good for the benefit of the public. But how do all these different actors fit in now? And I think that's one of the things that needs more thinking. And actually, I'm mentioning the carbon market space because it is a space that's this work is being figured out because it hasn't been figured out. Who in terms of who benefits. What kind of voice do people that where the carbon market projects are based on their, like, if they're the landowner, like what are their benefits? What do they get out of this deal? And what does the private sector do? And what is the state's role? And that's sort of being played out. Even the legal nature of this carbon credits is sort of like a new thing. So a lot of thinking has to be done, but I think fundamentally, to make this multi-stakeholder, or maybe we call it a pluralistic model work, is clear definition of maybe property rights, clear roles and responsibilities. Obviously, inclusiveness. Communities should definitely have a voice because ultimately they're the beneficiaries and they're also the implementers. And then I would say, thirdly, the benefit sharing. Who gets what? I think needs to be figured out. I think your last question, Arthur, about commodification of nature, maybe that sort of relates to my first point that there's multiple elements about what nature is anymore. It's not just something you buy and sell or own. It's got so many different types of values in terms of, it's for example, forests are basically their climate sinks. They also support livelihoods. They also protect biodiversities. And then they also have intrinsic values, makes you for well-being. So this type of, public goods, it requires a different model because it is a different thing. It's not something that you can buy and sell and have think that it's there forever. The idea of public goods is that it's I guess it goes to the fundamental problem. It's tragedy of the commons. It's people abuse it and then it leads to market failures. So again, I think how this will evolve is still being thought of. And of course, the future generation, and I think you talked about 7 generations, how do you even factor that in? And maybe there's mechanisms for environmental impact assessments, people should take into account future generations now, where it's not at all. It's that short-termism. So maybe that's a different way of doing EIAs. But I don't have all the answers. But I think it's just making us kind of rethink what nature is and what the current models are. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Daniel, speaking a lot about reimagining and need to reimagine how we're approaching public goods, and you're also saying earlier on that in your own work you've been coming up with new standards that sort of trying to broaden the stakeholder field. How, just give us a sense of how is this working, and in your view, is this reimagining that the previous 2 panelists have mentioned happening there? How are you bringing in new players, and what are the sort of dynamics that are happening there? How are these negotiations taking place, and what do you see emerging out of that in terms of the institution that you represent and that global, if you like, level of governance?
Sure, and thank you. And I appreciate very much the comments I've heard, because I think the lens that you've talked about, Crystal, is very helpful to stimulate my own thinking as well. So I'd also like to react and follow on to what you've said. The OECD has 200 different policy committees in different areas, so I can't really speak to the tax area that I don't work with. But speaking in terms of governance, what we promote, we don't impose a global standard, so to speak. These are voluntary standards. For anything to work, from my point of view, it works most effectively if you can have a sort of consensus-based development of a standard that's based on principles, which is what we've done in the corporate governance area, so that all of the 50 countries that were in the room agreed on the standard and agreed to promote it. That doesn't mean that they're bound by it to implement every measure, because every country is different and its circumstances are different, so you need to be able to adapt locally. So, for example, this week, I've been here for this meeting, but I've also been here for a workshop with the United Arab Emirates government and securities regulators and people from the market to talk about how they could implement the principles of corporate governance here in the UAE, which may have different elements. But everywhere we go, we also work very actively in Latin America. We have a network in Southern Africa for state-owned enterprises that we've worked with countries there. It's very important to take account of the local circumstances and adapt to that. And now the emphasis is really on this sustainability issue. How do we adapt to this? And I don't think there's 7 generations thinking going on, but at least, with the COP28, there is commitments to develop carbon net zero kinds of frameworks through 2050. So at least countries are beginning to think 25 years ahead. But for that to work, you need to have standards that allow you to compare information, for example, on disclosure. Not just in 2050 we expect to be there by a magic wand, but how do companies set standards in the interim? What are the targets, the metrics, so you have comparable information, so you can measure whether you're making the progress that you need to make. Just a last comment on this is that I think there's no one solution or one element that's going to solve this, but government leadership is crucial. And when some governments, for example, Costa Rica, which has state-owned enterprises in the energy sector, they task the state-owned enterprises with also being part of a plan to get to net zero, and I think that they're very close to net zero already at this stage. And other countries are trying to follow suit. But we've also seen total disasters of state-owned enterprises. I look at the Venezuela example. For some years, it was a fuel. You could provide public services based on all of the revenues that the state oil company was making. But eventually, some corruption took over, and less of it, the resources dried up, and it could no longer function. So this is why governance is so crucial, to have the board, the disclosure, and the state leadership in terms of a centralized approach, rather than having lots of different ministries all fighting with their own fiefdoms and their own special favors. You need to have this trust in institutions to work in combination with the private sector, where you can't finance and reach the global goals on sustainability without private sector finance. So that's also an important part of the equation, where these standards are really crucial to keep working. We're moving very incrementally, so it's not a revolution for sure when you're deciding things by consensus among governments of 50 countries. But I think that we're trying to help where we can.
Thank you very much. Okay, Daniel, it's your chance now to ask the panelists questions. So perhaps if you can, those of you who'd like to ask questions, put up your hands, and maybe we can have mics to go around to the, okay, the mic is coming. So the lady over there, if you could just be, again, very synthetic, just introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, and then give us your question.
Hi, I'm Deborah Webster, and I like to think about the future and how to course correct companies from today. 3 things I've been thinking about I'd love your views on. What about board members mandating every single company, or at least state-owned companies, to have a board member that represents future generations, so that way they're forced to think about the future in their current decision-making? Second one is putting things like water and air into trust for all of humanity, present and future generations. And I'm sure there's a few more I could come up with, but let's just go for those for now.
Okay, would like to go first?
Do you want to take a few?
Yeah.
I can answer the first question on the board.
Okay, maybe you start, and let's also have we only had one hand, or at least I saw one hand. Okay. I have the light in my face, so if there was another one, I didn't see it. But Daniel, you go, and yeah, if you can also raise your hand in the interim so that I can put you on the
Very
list.
interesting. It's actually the first time we had extensive stakeholder consultations for the revision of the principles, and nobody ever raised this specific proposal, which I find very interesting. But What I'd like to say in that is that it's part of a more general push to increase diversity of boards. There's been a very big push, as I'm sure you're aware, for women on boards, where across Europe now there's a 40% quota for women on boards. At the same time, there's this big push, you need to diversify boards to be able to handle all of these new issues. So you need to have somebody who's an expert on sustainability, you need to have somebody who's an expert on digitalization, you need to have somebody who's an expert on risk, you need to have somebody who's an expert on accounting. So the boards need to get bigger and bigger to have all this expertise potentially, or train them. But the other aspect of diversity that people don't talk about enough is in terms of age. And actually in the UAE, they've told me that they, in their corporate governance code, they now have a requirement also for age diversity, which maybe could be a proxy of people might be more inclined at a younger age to think more about future generations. So maybe it's a small step, but to actually have that idea, I think I'd be interested to see people debate that. It's a good idea.
Frankly, I love that idea because, with diversity, also I think just having a stakeholder, like the future generation stakeholder, it I think helps with the short-termism. It forces people to think long-term. I would love to see that integrated, like I said, in EIAs, in all sectors. At least it can help people think.
EIA stand for?
The environmental impact assessment that I mentioned. Why not? Because that's also very short-term based on project, but maybe we should go beyond that. We think about cumulative impacts or beyond, but maybe even take into account what would it mean for future generations if this project went ahead. But I think it would help people think longer term, and that's one of the fundamental issues with the way public goods are thought of. So I love it.
I third the love. I think a lot of the things that we do at NAWI is to deconstruct and reconstruct in a world where a lot of the framings, governance models that exist, there's a sort of like almost compliance with that's just the way it is. And I think we've gotten to peak point now where we have to be brave enough, we have to be audacious enough to completely tear these things apart and reconstruct it. They were all constructs. How a board looks like, how it functions, how it moves, what we decide is common, what we decide is privatized, what we decide to commodify. All of those have been a construct that were created by a group of people, probably in a room somewhere like this. And so I think, recreating, reimagining boldly, very audaciously what a board could look like, I think is central to that. What water, air, green spaces is something that is so lacking in so many of our worlds right now, is something that we have to put at the center of the table. Another thing that we think of at NAWI is who gets to say what the world looks like in the future and currently. Who has the power to sit in these rooms to influence the decisions that govern life and dignity and access and justice. And so having different ways to look at what a board looks like could be a good part of that. And also reimagining ideas such as maybe we need to put rivers, green spaces, leaves, trees in trust. And they belong to all of us, and we should all have equal access in a world that's really pushing us against that. So thank you for that.
We have all these legal structures, we're not using them in a smart enough way. I find it fascinating. Yeah. And the other one is, if we extract resources from Earth, does that make Earth a shareholder?
Hi everybody, I'm Joachim Isaacson, working for the UK Global Strategic Trends Programme. And my question is about one of the constraints for delivery of public goods, corruption. Corruption drives inequality everywhere in the world. You have to pay for things that should be free. And I just want your view on how do we develop systems that are robust enough to withstand that? Are we going in the right direction, or what's your view in 10 years? Are we less corrupt or more corrupt, and what will influence that?
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Adjadonu, Future Generations Global Ambassador on the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I am also an executive board member at International Student Young Progress, where I serve as External Partnerships Coordinator and lead the Africa project focused on capacity building for young Africans in nuclear energy, and nuclear disarmament. And I think my question would go to Daniel, particularly regarding nuclear energy and the OECD's role. I see a lot of work with the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency and capacity building, but what efforts are being made to make nuclear technologies accessible to countries in the global south? Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Francisco. I'm from the Center of Planning and Foresight of the Portuguese government, recently created. It's kind of a broad question, and in a sense it's a counterpoint to what was just said, because I see government intervention, public goods completely going backwards. I mean, in decay, I see a profound commodification of everything. Personal data is just the most obvious example. Reverse privatization, I mean, you name it, it's going on right now. So I see that the trend is against public goods. It's the opposite. It's total commodification of everything for very particular, narrow reasons. And I'm sorry, I can accept a bit of corruption, but having a public good instead of having this complete privatization of everything. Yeah. So my broad question, and I'm not going to go into taxes, I guess that would be another session, and what are like digital platforms that are not connected to any particular country. Yeah. Except they are, but they don't pay their taxes anyway. But I'm not going to go into that, but just the question of how can we some pointers to reverse this trend towards total commodification, privatization of every single piece, even if of our body information.
Yeah. I think we can have a tax session on the sidelines, because I'd really like to be part of that. I'll start the conversation on corruption, and it ties in with tax. So the statistic for Africa is we lose 89 to 90 billion, and that's a very conservative figure, through illicit financial flows. Corruption is something that we engage with, but I like to say language matters and narratives matter, and they're powerful and political. So I live in Kenya. I was born in Kenya, grew up, left from my university, came back, and I understand the nuance of living in a space where corruption is in your face almost every day. But if we put it into context, only 5% of that $90 billion annually leaves our continent through corrupt channels or through corruption. The biggest part of it, 35% of it, is through illegal criminal activity, trafficking of people and trees and all of that. The largest part, over 60%, is through commercial activities. It's multinationals operating in our jurisdictions, finding loopholes in our systems to move money away into tax havens, basically. And so when you look at the corruption map, all the red, super corrupt countries are in the global south. If you look at the tax haven map, it's a complete opposite. And so who defines what corruption is also very political and important to redefine. And I end with that. Language is really important and matters, and what narratives we're telling, what narratives we're telling both ourselves and what narratives are being told about us. I agree on commodification, and I can deal with a little bit of corruption, but the liberation of public goods and public services is a sovereignty question as well. It's a question of life at the very heart of it. And releasing ourselves from that chokehold is something that we fight every day. Who defines how the narratives that suggest that private sector is more efficient, will be better. From an African perspective, if you're looking at illicit financial flows with over 60% of the money leaving, it's the same multinationals doing these practices that we're then supposedly going to put, our healthcare, our education, our roads in these hands. And so I think, making sure that we're doing the work to make sure everyday citizens understand this and demand for better. There are constitutional provisions. The problem with PPPs in my country and many other African countries is a complete lack of transparency in terms of who's signing contracts, based on what, how do they get prioritized, on whose benefit are they, who benefits financially as well. All of these are so hazy, and those are things that we have to constantly push against. Our constitutions are on our side, but constantly pushing and fighting and making sure that our our struggles are not held in silos, but are speaking to each other. The tax justice one must speak to a gender one, must speak to a labor union one, and all of these, and climate as well. And without that happening, it'll be, I can only see not a very great future in terms of commodification and the financialization of everything, including ourselves.
Thanks, Crystal. Perhaps I've been very influenced by all the technology sessions, the promise of technology and digital tools, and I think this could address the issue with corruption, with commodification, and I guess protecting nature, including compliance and enforcement of laws. It's very expensive, it's very resource intensive, the transaction costs are high. So I've been reading a lot of articles on the promise of different digital tools in terms of bringing down the transaction costs, actually monitoring compliance, increasing transparency and accountability. So even for, I would say even carbon markets, maybe I'll bring it again. A lot of the issue is, these projects go on without much transparency, but if you, verify or use technology, including blockchain, it could kind of get rid of some of the corruptions that them not meeting the sustainability goals. Same thing with sustainability linked instruments. And then even verifying that it's, the money that the private sector used, it actually did something good, and there's, geospatial analysis and different types of digital tools that can be used, but maybe, more, utilization, finding better use cases of technology to protect nature, to ensure that in that, PPP projects or just any type of financial instruments or even, multilateral environmental laws that they're actually being complied with. I think there could be, digital tools like blockchain, AI, even tokenization that could kind of, help with the corruption issue, can be explored further. Thanks.
I understand we're out of time almost, so I can be very quick. Partly because, Daniel, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question because I don't work for the Nuclear Energy Agency. I'm not familiar with what they're doing. But I could comment on the corruption issues in particular, because that is an area that, first of all, if the governance structures are working well, there's less need, but you always need a good enforcement structure. It's quite complex, quite multi-layered. We have a specific guideline for state-owned enterprises for anti-corruption and integrity in state-owned enterprises that helps address that. All of these standards are free and available on the OECD website, so if you're curious, you can look more at those. But in the end, I think that it's with good governance that you can help to build the trust in institutions, and also in the private sector side of things, because the public sector can't deliver these services that we're talking about unless they have the revenues, which come also from the private sector. So you really need to make both parts work well to also give the public sector a chance to deliver those services that are so important and better at the core to be delivered by the public sector. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Christina, Crystal. It's been a great conversation. I guess you can imagine this could be an entire day or more, talking about public goods and what you ought to do about them and how they ought to be shaped. But it's given you a flavor of, I think, some of the challenges that are there. We're talking of a tech world, but I think many of the challenges we're talking are much, much more fundamental, much, much more simple. It's about trust, it's about accountability, it's about who shapes the questions, which people are invited to the table. And those are the things that will also shape that future. So we need to reimagine institutions. It's a collective thing, and there are things that can help us. But it's an ongoing piece of work. So thank you very much, and I'd like you to give the panel a big clap and yourselves. And thank you very much.